Hello and welcome to Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast. I'm Paul Healy and I'm joined by Michael O'Toole. We normally are discussing the week's crime stories, but today we're answering your many questions. So I think we're just going to get straight to it, Mick. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. There's some really, really excellent and very intriguing and challenging questions. So thanks to all our listeners. They're very good.
Appreciate the questions. First one is, I suppose, surprise, surprise, in relation to Jerry the Monk Hutch. And it was directed to you. Make a question for the pod. We messaged a while back on Jerry Hutch's costs. Where are things with that? There are a number of files with the DPP in relation to the feud. I believe Patsy, for one, regarding the Regency, and a couple more in relation to Neddy Hutch's murder.
Okay, so we'll talk about Jerry Hutch first. So we've spoken about this before, but the Central Criminal Court and the Special Criminal Court, the top tier criminal courts in the country, they're very, very expensive. And it's unheard of for anybody going to the Special or the Central not to get legal aid. And the reason for that is it costs hundreds of thousands of euro. And I know that it makes good stories about, this fella who's on 80 grand a year, got legal aid. But I don't think anybody could really afford the legal fees involved in a trial. So I remember when Mr. Hutch first appeared in court, you and I were there, Paul. Remember he was flown in to Baldonnel, Casement Aerodrome at Baldonnel by the Air Corps, the CAS 235. And he was brought to the Special. You and I were there, and Paul Scott was the detective superintendent to give evidence. Now, you and I have covered so many cases that usually in a first appearance, there's an application for legal aid.
Yes.
And do you remember that there was no application for legal aid?
There was no application. It was discussed then whether his costs would be covered at the end of the trial, and that was challenged by the state. Now, interestingly, even though Jerry Hutch effectively walked out a free man, and the case against him fell apart. Because of that challenge, it came before Miss Justice Tara Burns again to make the decision as it related to Jerry Hutch's costs.
Yes, so essentially there was no legal aid application, so he effectively, or who in reality, was covering his own legal fees. Now, let me tell you, the Special Criminal Court is akin to the High Court, and the High Court is not cheap. It's tens of thousands of euro every single day. People like Brendan Grehan, Anne-Marie Lawler, who was in charge of was the chief prosecutor for the Joseph Puska case, they are paid significant amounts of money, justifiably in my view, because they're fighting for people's liberty or they're fighting for prosecutions and stuff. But anyway, so he didn't apply for legal aid. So we knew from the start that he had to pay for his own fees. So as you say, when he won his case, he went to court to try and get that order. I think it was an order overturned, basically, that he wouldn't have to pay his legal fees, but he lost. So it's anywhere between €500,000 and €1 million that he's got a legal bill for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious chunk of money, and we now understand that he's not even going to appeal that decision. So he's obviously accepted that he's going to have to pay those costs. Of course, I suppose on one hand, he's probably just saying, am I lucky I'm not in prison for the rest of my life? But that's a serious chunk of money, and your average punter wouldn't be able to pay it. So clearly Jerry Hutch is a man of means.
Yes, and because he didn't go for legal aid, when you go for legal aid, you had to give a statement of means. So he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to give sworn evidence about what money he had. Maybe that's just a coincidence. But for whatever reason, he decided to pay for this himself. Now, what's interesting, in a civil case, usually if you win your civil case, say defamation or personal injuries, you get your costs afforded to you. So Jerry Hutch won in this case, but it's significant that he did not get his costs.
Mm-hmm. And the second part of that question, which is, when we first got it, inspired a story. And I suppose we have gone on to answer it since in our reporting. But the person's asking about the file that was sent to the DPP and made us realize that actually a file had gone in relation to a number of individuals, including Patsy Hutch. But of course, we can answer that question quite definitively now.
But there's not going to be any more prosecutions as it stands unless something miraculous happens. So you'll know that there was a nolle prosequi entered for Patrick Hutch when the case against him for murder collapsed. Nolle prosequi means that it can be re-entered. That's not going to happen. Files were sent to the DPP after the Jerry Hutch trial. What did Justice Tara Burns say about Patsy Hutch?
She said a lot about him, a lot more than she could say about Jerry Hutch and his connection to the Regency shooting. She said that there was evidence that showed that Patsy was central to the transfer of the weapons. So remember Shane Roan out on the Malahide Road being given the AK-47 rifles used in the Regency attack. He was in and around Patsy Hutch that day. There was plenty of surveillance on both of men, and Miss Justice Harburn said that he was central to the transfer of the firearms. She also said that it appeared from the evidence where everybody met up at Buckingham Street before the shooting that Patsy was integral to that and central probably to the overall plotting of the Regency Hotel shooting. But of course, he wasn't the man on trial.
Mm-hmm.
So even though she could give her I suppose, opinion based upon the evidence, it means nothing. And obviously, when that evidence and God knows what else was brought before the DPP, they've decided not to charge him.
Yeah, and the DPP sees all the evidence. We don't. We rely on scraps really until there's a court case, and then we hear the evidence. So who knows why? But for whatever reason, no more charges in relation to the Regency.
Which is major, I mean, but I suppose, look, obviously the case against Jerry Hutch was an embarrassment to the state. Um, you look, they pinned everything on Jonathan Dowdall. They tried to say that he was the shooter. They were left with egg on their face, and I think that that has to be taken into has to have been taken into consideration as well. Do they really want to try another probably circumstantial case and lose? So obviously, I'd say that was a huge factor.
Apart from the troubles, I can't recall a more brazen and daring crime than the Regency.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there were things up north and IRA and UVF things, but what that gang did, the Hutch organized crime gang did that day, we will be talking about this for decades to come. It was really, really brazen, and it did go around the world.
Brazen, but it appears they have gotten away with it largely. Okay, there are people in prison. They did manage to prosecute Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy in relation to driving two of the getaway vehicles, and they managed to prosecute Jonathan Dowdall and his father in relation to booking the hotel room for one of the shooters. They were going to prosecute flat cap Kevin Murray. Of course, he died before they could do that. And they tried to prosecute Patrick Hutch, but of course we mentioned the Noel Prosecchi. And now with this, looks like no one else will be brought to court. So the two people that walked in and shot and killed David Byrne will probably never be in court unless new evidence comes to light, which is highly unlikely.
And I remember doing a story shortly afterwards. There were maybe a dozen people involved in the whole organization, but wasn't it 5 or 6 were in the van who were the hit team?
Yes,
including Flat Cap and whoever the man dressed as Owen was. So it was about 5 or 6 people, really, wasn't it? The shooters, shall we say, and the actual actors in the killing.
Mm-hmm. Who and the ones that actually fired those fatal shots will probably likely be never brought to justice, despite the fact that it is the most heinous gangland crime in the history of our state. Sadly, it looks like it's probably not going to go any further.
But we can say that the Kinahan cartel believes certain people were involved, and they made significant efforts to kill them. And you never know what will happen in the future. They might get them.
Well, look, yeah, I mean, we say that the feud is effectively over, but it only takes one incident really for it to reignite. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yes, this is still late, and this is another great question. You'll remember during the trial when you were covering, there was a really weird day when there was evidence that another prisoner had come forward to say he was the Regency shooter.
Yeah,
it came out of nowhere, didn't it?
It did. It was in January. So kind of coming towards the end of the trial, there was I remember a curious development, as we were told, by the senior counsel, Brendan Gretton, who was defending for Jerry Hutch. We initially didn't know what the curious development was. It then emerged that a prisoner who was on remand at the time had penned a letter and had come forward to a prison staff member saying that he was responsible for the murder of David Byrne, that he shot and killed David Byrne in the Regency Hotel that day, and that Jerry Hutch was innocent. And this letter ultimately made its way all the way to the prosecution and the defense in the case. They were made aware of it, and then they were struggling to kind of deal with it really, and to whether it had to be admitted into evidence. This was heard outside of the jury. Sorry, there was no jury. Nearly said there was a jury there. This was, initially sort of mentioned as an issue rather than something that derailed the trial. But it was brought up, and ultimately, over a period of time, it was put to one side. And when we came back to it, ultimately, it had no bearing on the actual trial. Since then, I've just made inquiries on the back of this question from our listener. And look, we have to be careful. There are ongoing legal matters, but we understand that Gardaí obviously had to investigate this and determined it was bogus and nonsensical. This person was may have actually been known to Jerry Hutch in the past through the boxing kind of inner city world, but is a nobody in some respects, and a heroin addict, and has been in and out of the courts for many, many years, and obviously wanted his 15 minutes of fame. But Gardaí aren't taking it any further, as far as I understand. And as for the prison service, I know he was initially moved prison. He was on remand. He has since subsequently been convicted of an assault charge. And I can't say much more than that because there are ongoing legal matters. But yeah, I mean, that's that. I hope that answers the listener's question, really.
I don't. I'm not asking him, just putting this out there. I'd still love to know why. Will we ever know why, unless he spills his beans? Really,
Why he
why he did it? Why he came
confessed?
forward? Yeah.
I think he was looking for, if certainly if you look at his track record and the things he's been up for, a bit like another infamous prisoner who just likes to have himself in the news. I wonder, was that what it was all about? Whether anyone from, Jerry Hutch's world who was sympathetic to him pressured this individual to do this to try and derail the trial. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that. It's possible, but it seems that the Garda investigation into it is not progressing. It's all been put to one side. It could have been more serious if it was somebody who, actually possibly could have been in the Regency that day, but this individual has got nothing to do with any of that. So I think he's just been put down to a messer, really.
Well, it was some mess. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, question three. Yeah, Janie Mack. We're nowhere through it yet. If you could have any infamous suspect on the podcast, who would you choose and why? And they've mentioned, for example, Daniel Kinahan, Christy Kinahan, Jerry Hutch, Joe O'Reilly, or Larry Murphy. Interesting question.
Can I go for two?
You can,
And
yeah.
you and I differ on this. I know who you're going to say. In a heartbeat, I would have Christy Kinahan. In an absolute heartbeat, he is a figure of fascination for me.
Mm.
Most criminals are not necessarily intelligent, maybe cute and good at street fighting, that sort of thing. I think Christy Kinahan is a very intelligent man. His cartel went from nothing to probably €1.5 billion. He has largely, in the last 20 years, stayed out of prison. He was in Spain for a while in 2010 and then transferred to Belgium. But international law enforcement agencies have gone after him big time. There's a $5 million bounty on his head, and Christopher Jr., the son, and Daniel, the Don Corleone, I suppose. I am fascinated by Christy Kinahan. I
Yeah,
want to know his story.
I mean, look, would we turn down an interview with any of those people? No. Yeah, would we love to speak to Christy Kinahan? Yeah, but I suppose there's an element of, you know, um, if I was sitting in front of Daniel Kinahan and I actually had an opportunity to interview him and his father, um, you'd be fearful in one respect, but I would just have a level of disgust and for an individual like that, and I would feel as though I wouldn't want to facilitate them in any kind of propaganda. Now we're talking total la la land here. This isn't going to happen, but yeah, I suppose that's why they weren't my first choice. I would say Jerry Hutch. Now again, similar, he's got a history in gangland, and yeah, we wouldn't want to just kiss his arse and let him off the hook. Any real journalist wants to put challenging questions anyway. But for me, similar reasons to yourself, I think he's a fascinating character, and when he was interviewed by Paul Reynolds all those years ago, that interview it lives in infamy, and it was an incredible interview. To have that level of interview with him now, can you imagine? Like all of, I suppose that's why he's an interesting subject to me because so much has happened to Jerry Hutch. I mean, take aside his criminal connections for a minute, he is a man who has actually suffered a lot. He has lost his brother in a murder. He's lost many of his nephews. His whole family was torn apart by the feud because of the feud. He was accused of the biggest murder in the gangland murder history of the state, and he was acquitted for it. I mean, he has an incredible life story that would be amazing to ask him about. I mean, we have no idea about where he was on the day of the Regency shooting. He's never going to have to answer that question. It never came up in the trial. Even just to ask him that, where were you that day? There's so much that I would love to ask him about the trial experience. Yeah, I mean, he would be the ultimate interview in that respect. I think that's why I would say him.
Another person I would love to interview would be this man. Can't name him, and there's a question about naming criminals in a while. Mr. Big. He
Oh yeah.
is also a significant step or grade above most criminals. The guards haven't really landed a punch on him. They have made repeated efforts. So he's a North Dublin criminal, heavily involved in drugs, was heavily involved in drugs and robberies. And yeah, I've done plenty of stories about him. Yeah, I think we estimated maybe 15 or 16 murders connected to him and his gang in the last maybe 20 years. But, he's not one of these people who courts publicity, in my mind. And some criminals do. And I'm very interested in his story and how has he survived and flourished and not been caught or not been killed. The real IRA gave him significant problems in around 2012, and that led to the murder of a real IRA chief called Alan Ryan. I mean, I know that he threw a pint of beer over Mr. Big in a pub, and they were trying to have a meeting to sort it out because they were extorting money from criminals. Mm-hmm. So there was that, and Mr. Big just got him whacked. So he's a very interesting character. I'm not saying I support these people, but it's not our job as journalists. And he's great. He's not. Yeah, they're very interesting people, and I will say this as well. I would absolutely love to interview a former IRA volunteer at the height of the Troubles.
That would be fascinating.
I remember a friend of mine was talking to a former volunteer, and they said to them, just even things like this, what's your favorite gun? And he went, oh, definitely Kalashnikov, just the feel of it. Mm-hmm. So somebody involved in what they call a war, it wasn't a war for me, but anyway, just how do you get involved? But it would have to be honest. What is it like to kill somebody? What is it like to walk up and shoot somebody in the back of the head? Did you ever have qualms about it? Do you ever have nightmares? It's one of the great things that is unresolved. People who were as combatants, terrorists, cops, whatever, their stories haven't really been heard. And I would love to interview an IRA man like that who would just be, okay, what do you want to know?
That could happen. Unlike maybe some of the other fantastical interviews we're talking about here. Joe O'Reilly, just because the listener mentioned him, I mean, it would be fascinating to ask Joe O'Reilly how his search is going for the quote unquote real murderer. I'd love to find out how his time in prison has been and how he continues to live in delusion that he hasn't admitted the murder of his wife. But yeah, I mean, this person specifically asked me about a podcast. You wouldn't have the likes of him on a podcast, but that would be a fascinating question to ask him.
Maybe we'll doorstep one day if and when he gets out and if and when he accepts.
Oh, I don't. I could be retiring by the time he's let out.
No, that's true.
Next question.
Okay. Yeah, this is a good one, and it's very relevant. Why do some figures in organised crime get named by the media and others don't? For example, Daniel Kinahan has no relevant convictions in the state. He was charged with one driving offence at 21, whereas he names somebody with a cat name who has a number of convictions, but is only written about in terms of aliases for many years. Not asking about the specifics of each individual, of course, but what is the general thought or reasoning for this?
There's a bit of a grey area with this, isn't there? But
Mm.
when it comes to Daniel Kinahan, I mean, look, obviously his father was infamous and named prior to him. So the sons, Daniel and Christy, they came onto the Garda radar pretty early on. And, I suppose under the cover of their father already be written about, they ultimately were going to get written about. But Daniel and Christie were part of the investigation in Spain, Operation Shovel, and were arrested in relation to that. I think from the moment that happened, it was game over. They were always going to be named from that point on because there were major, major suspects over in Spain. They were arrested over in Spain. Okay, they weren't that ultimately all fell apart. And yes, that listener is right. They haven't been charged with any serious offence over here in Ireland. But nonetheless, I mean, when you get to that kind of level of gangster, there's a certain cover because these people don't have the ability really to defend themselves. And it's quite unlikely that they're going to come and defend themselves in court because they would then have to prove they're not a criminal, and they're not going to do that. This person mentioned a specific criminal in their question who we can't name, but they named him. Um, there are many different reasons why that person cannot be named. One of which I would say you might have a different opinion, but Mick, but this person who we call Mr. Flashy has been accused of multiple murders. And if we're going to, in the media, publish, which we have, that he's behind a number of murders, if we're going to suddenly name him tomorrow, he would have a defamation case on his hands because those cases have not been proven against him.
And it's not even if it goes to court. People can initiate legal proceedings. And I can tell you, you'll know this, Paul, it's extremely, and I mentioned this earlier in relation to Jerry Hutch. Most defamation cases take place in the High Court, which is this sort of civil version of the Central Criminal Court. It's senior counsels, right? Sometimes two senior counsel on each side, plus junior barristers, BLs, and solicitors. It's very, very, very expensive. And I'm not talking about our own place, I'm just talking about the media in general. Very often, they will take this game and go, right, cost benefit analysis here. Is it worth fighting this, or is it worth giving them more than a few quid to make this go away? So Ireland has very, very restrictive media laws.
Libel laws.
Libel laws. And I will also say Kinahan is very, very interesting because, so I first did stories about him in the early 90s, Daniel, when he was charged. Got the first picture of him in handcuffs in the back of a garden. But for a long time, we didn't name any of the Kinahans. And it was only, I think it was really Operation Shovel in 2010. Mm-hmm. But even then, when they were named, there was still a timorousness about naming people. And I think really it was only after the Regency that the media really went, okay, we're doing this. And then senior Gardaí started naming the Kinahan cartel in court, and that gives us a legal protection. But in the early 90s, they would have had the same cover really as everybody else, but it's just, essentially, they became so big. And if you have Americans going after them, you have to name them.
He wouldn't have been called a mob boss, I don't think, until we got to around the time of the Regency, and that, or Operation Shovel anyway, was the straw that broke the camel's back. Before that, I think it was probably because they were the sons of already infamous Godfather Christy Kinahan that gave you a certain level of cover to write about them.
I think it's fair to say most criminals aren't named. When they're convicted criminals, they can be named, but the vast majority of serious criminals under the radar, or whatever you call it, who have been at the centre of Garda Doc B investigations and local drugs unit and that sort of thing, they're not named. Same way, for example, Joe Riley was a suspect for the murder, right? Now, he outed himself as a suspect, which was grand. You could say the self-confessed. Ian Bailey did the same, but there was that lacuna or that space between the murder and when he outed himself that you wouldn't be named. So you have to talk about the suspect. I remember writing about a man known to Rachel O'Reilly being the suspect in all this for his locality. That our defamation laws are so strong that that's it. So what paper is going to take that chance?
Exactly, and it is quite a ridiculous situation because your other option, if you're not going to give people nicknames, is to not write about them at all. And of course, we have to write about events that surround individuals like Mr. Big and Mr. Flashy, especially when these people are dropping bodies, when they are literally responsible for murders. And we know that there's multiple Garda investigations in relation to X person and Y person. We're going to have to give them names to make it easier for the public to understand who it is we're talking about, because unfortunately we are restricted by those libel laws that we can't name them.
Yeah, that's it. So look, and the funny thing is, various people can be named on social media. Absolutely no problem. To be honest, if Mr. Big is named on social media and he's named in the Star, who's he going to come after? Some fella, John 4341279 with 3 followers, or us? That's it.
Well, when it comes to Mr. Flashy, perhaps someday soon, his identity and everything about him will come out. But it's not that we're deliberately withholding that information. It's just that we would be sued to high heaven if we did.
Look, I don't want people to take this in the wrong way. When criminals are murdered or die, they can't sue for defamation, so we can name them then. Now, that's not cowardice. It's just the way it is. You just get sued. So Eamon Dunn was killed at 10:05 on a Friday night on the 23rd of April, 2010. Right. And it's the first time we've heard of murders within 3 minutes. It just exploded. So he was named almost immediately after the next day he was named on papers. But before that, he wasn't known as Eamon Dunn. He was, there were a couple of things where he tried to take legal action against media and that sort of thing, and he was named in court in that regard. But looking back, he was a serious criminal back in his day, and we just couldn't name him.
Was it Veronica Guerin that named the monk first? Or she was certainly among the first to actually name him. And I think before that he was just otherwise referred to as, under some sort of alias or whatever.
It could have been. I started really in crime in the year 2000, so Veronica was murdered in June 1996, so it's slightly before my time, but that does ring a bell.
And even Gilligan wasn't initially named until he was imprisoned, really. If he did. My colleague and friend John Rooney interviewed him shortly after the murder of Veronica Guerin, and he was unmasked. But I sometimes look back in old articles and other papers, and you can see after the murder of Veronica, the papers were all writing about Gilligan, but they weren't naming him. That's just we have a similar question that we've been asked about people who are under the radar, and are there lots of people? In general, yes, there are many criminals out there that we just cannot write about until they get to a level of infamy where they get a nickname. But that's I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that we are restricted by the law, the libel law, and just how easily it can be to get sued, even to possibly identify somebody tangentially. Even we have to be so careful. That's just the reality.
Most defamation cases, to my experience, really are about identification. So you have to be really careful, even if you're not naming the person. People think, right, because you're not naming, and I've seen this on Twitter, I didn't name him. It doesn't matter if you named him. If that person can say those factors, those 3 pieces of information in your story lead people to believe that I'm that murderer, I'm that killer, I'm that criminal, then you're banjaxed.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. Really, it's a question for you, so I'm asking it. It's a very good one. I've been just listening to a podcast you did about the real/new IRA. It made me think back to when I lived in the Liberties in 89-90. I was 16 or 17 when I moved there from London via Coolock and Ballymun. My partner was born in Dublin, had family and friends in both areas, as well as Finglas and Kilbarrack, the flats. weren't a community of saints with drug and alcohol use, but at least we didn't live in the Sheriff Street flats. I was told that the drugs were kept down by the threat of retribution from the provisional IRA. Do you think the dismantling of the provisional organization had a big effect on the amount of drugs coming in?
Yes. It's really hard for you young ones to realize what a force the provisional IRA was in the 70s and 80s. Probably began to wane in the 90s, although there were some big atrocities. And one of the things that Southern Command, which is what it was called, there were Northern Command included the six in the north, and I think Donegal, Cavan, and Leitrim, Louth, Monaghan, but Southern Command was everywhere down from that. And one of their things was by providing logistics for the north and for operations in Britain. But they were very, very active in tackling drugs criminals in the Republic. And they did it up north. I remember actually when I started in journalism up north in 1994. It was June 1994. And in August 1994, the first ceasefire happened. It was there until February 1996. So the IRA stopped killing people. UVF, UDA did a month later. But there was an organization called Direct Action Against Drugs. And that was a cover name, believed, widely accepted that it was a cover name for the IRA. So what they were doing, there were a fella, I remember there's a fella who was shot there. They killed, it could have been up to a dozen suspected or alleged drug dealers in Belfast and other parts of the north in that time. And that was an indicator for me that the IRA were taking on the drugs criminals. People, look, you know what, people might want to hear this. I can only give you my truth. I remember talking to a very senior Garda detective who'd been after the RA or the IRA for years. I said, look, what's the story? Were they involved in drugs? He said, no. So I can only take what people tell me, people I trust. It's like you, Paul, you have people you trust. And, you know, what also people who weren't involved in the troubles really don't realize is that, and I mean this, the pathological hatred ordinary Gardaí had for the IRA. They despised them. So when I asked that very senior detective, were the IRA involved in drugs? He said no. And I can only take what he says, right? But yes, so there were, and I also remember in the early to mid 19, there was a number of murders in Dublin of people alleged to be involved in the drugs trade. So yeah, the IRA did go after drugs people, and I think they did intimidate drug dealers and frighten drug dealers. And I think once the IRA put their guns away, no, that was in 2003, was it? But, you know, once they decided to go a political route, I think drug dealers became much more confident. Now, that probably coincided with an increase in drugs generally in Europe and everything. But it's my firm belief that the fear that drug dealers had about the IRA dissipated. And I think they became more cocky and much more arrogant.
Fascinating. And there's a second part to that question. Have you looked at the effect that the gang wars and the general drug situation in Dublin has had on the amount of visitors, not just tourists, but Irish people living abroad going to Dublin?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, maybe we should talk about this because we know that there have been a number of tourists assaulted. We know that Stephen Termini, who you have spoken to quite a lot, he was an American citizen, suffered an alleged assault on Talbot Street. I remember doing a story a couple of weeks later about, I think it was a Welsh tourist around Camden Street, was beaten up and robbed by two women.
And there was a Canadian tourist also who was killed. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So, you know that I look at international media a lot. I have to be honest. Look, you want me to be honest? I haven't really seen much coverage of that sort of thing in the foreign media. So whenever I read, El País or, La Repubblica or whatever, you don't really see stories about how dangerous Ireland is. Now, I think that man is saying, or that person is saying that he believes Dublin is unsafe and that there's a reputation for Dublin being unsafe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the gang wars are necessarily. I mean, look, during the height of the Kinahan Hutch feud, I think that the inner cities definitely felt unsafe, and but I would say that it's not apart from O'Connell Street, I suppose, a tourist area. yeah, but more recently, with the attacks that have happened on tourists and other members of the public, I just would say that I've noticed that footfall has declined in the city centre. I've been out in town a couple of times and found that it's quite quiet. I mean, I was in a pub on a Saturday, usually quite a busy pub, in the north side of the city, and it was empty.
Wow.
Now it might also be because the price of pints has gone through the absolute roof, but no, I can't help but know. So I'm just talking anecdotally as a dub, really, not as a crime correspondent. That yeah, people do seem to be staying out of the city, and you can't help but think that maybe some of that is at least having an effect on Irish people, local people, not even wanting to come into their own city centre.
Like, so whenever I go to Italy, there's things called the pizzi. Is it pizzi, where Lock men, but very aggressive
Mm,
Lock men in Rome, and they get really violent if you don't give them money for parking, and they extort money from you. So I think, in every country, major metropolis like Dublin is, there's maybe people in Dublin.
mm,
You have to have your wits about you. And I'm not giving out about people who are attacked. People can be unlucky, and they can be unlucky, and they can be too risk. Like for example, when I lived in Italy, I'd always be wary of. I'd go to a lot of train stations, and train stations in Italy, they can be quite rough, and the areas around them can be quite rough. I think same for
mm,
France. So
mm,
look, I haven't seen that coverage in international media about Dublin being an unsafe place, but I will say, just getting back to the Troubles, there's no doubt that inward investment in tourism, not only in the north but the border counties, has improved dramatically since the Troubles ended. So maybe people were seeing that, and maybe I'm old enough to remember this. People, foreign people would go, "I don't want to go to Dublin. That's where the IRA are." So even then, maybe they
mm.
see all the stuff about the Troubles, and that would have affected them. But I don't think gangland really has. It's only my opinion. I don't think gangland has really affected tourism here.
Thankfully not. So I think we'll leave that there. That's the first part of our Q&A. We've got many more questions to get to. So if you tune in next week, we've got some more of your questions answered. Thanks very
Thanks,
much.
thanks very much, everybody.